Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. After about 11 months of studying this issue now, often to the exclusion of any other study, I finally feel like I'm at a point where I am resolved on the textual view on the beginning of the Torah scriptural day. While I've talked about this on the channel before, I realize now that since then I have learned more, and maybe I was overlooking some things in the past. And I want to describe a situation that we have all been in one way or another along this journey. We've all had a situation where we have read a verse many times before it finally clicked and we finally realized what it said. And whether that exactly applies with this topic or not is yet to be seen, but I was talking with two different people recently about this very experience. There are people in Torah-focusing circles who have read passages about observing and doing the Torah many, many times over the course of many years before finally realizing, oh, maybe we're supposed to follow the Torah. The mind has a way to process these things which is not just based upon what it says. It's not only a matter of the exact words in the verse. It's not only a matter of the meaning of those words. In our brain, we are sorting this information according to what we think the context is. And part of that context that we think is present is our beliefs. In the case of those beliefs being exactly correct, then maybe that's fine. But in the case that there's something we could still learn, like in the case of people who have read the Torah and have not processed what it says, have not realized that doing the Torah is the thing to do, then clearly we might be missing out and we're not seeing it for what it actually is. And this is related to confirmation bias, seeing only validation, the bias of where we place our attention, the acts of projecting and reading into things. I think it is important to acknowledge how powerful all of this can be. And that's something I believe applies to everyone, including me, and being aware of it helps, but just being aware of it alone does not neutralize the effect. It's just a normal thing that goes on in our mind. And in going into the study about when the day begins, when the day ends, one thing I tried to do was just not care what the result would be, although that is certainly easier said than done. I tried to just concern myself with wanting to know what the truth is and wanting to do what the truth is. I don't want to be afraid of what the truth is. And instead of keeping my conclusion a secret and just trying to lead you on through the progression of the logic until the end of the video and then dropping the bomb then, instead of doing that, I will tell you up front what my view is, and I fully realize that what I'm about to talk about is a controversial perspective. And the only reason that I want to hold it is because I believe it to be the textual way. I believe that it is superior in a textual perspective compared with the other views on this subject. And if I am wrong, I sincerely want to be corrected on it and made to understand. And this is a view which, whenever I first heard about it, whenever I heard about it leading up till about a year ago, I would just utterly dismiss it. I thought, well, that's obviously wrong. That's obviously wrong because of Leviticus 23:32, where it says from evening unto evening. And that's obviously wrong because of Genesis 1:5, where it says what it says there. And we'll talk about both of those verses. I would just dismiss the view out of hand. I wouldn't even consider it. It wasn't even on the radar because it didn't need to be from my perspective. There wasn't any element of doubt about it. And frankly, most of the cases or arguments that I had seen leading up to that point were not very good. Most of them were very emotional and seemed to be based on not very good evidence in my view, and so I didn't see the reason to evaluate this. It wasn't until about a year ago that I was researching some other topic wherein I was exposed to something which I think is decent evidence. And it was at that point I started thinking, well, maybe I should consider this, and this view that I have decided to consider and that I believe is textually superior is the day beginning in the morning. That the day begins in the morning rather than beginning at evening or at night. And throughout the course of this video, I want to consider what I think would be the case for the different sides of this subject, especially the case for the evening side, because that's what I would have held before. And like I said, if I am missing something, if I'm misinterpreting something, or if I'm wrong about something on the textual side, then I would like to be set straight on this issue. And I just want to clarify for those of you that have already decided that you're going to set me straight on this, I just ask that you please watch the video and try to understand my perspective before telling me how my perspective is wrong. Because just raising a verse here or there that may be seen as casting doubt on the issue is not going to be enough if it doesn't actually address the key points in my mind that need to be addressed for me. So please try to consider that if you were so inclined. And I am motivated to hold a different view. Part of me is motivated to change my mind about this. But what I have to do, regardless of what else has been done in the past, or regardless of what else is done by other people, I have to pay attention to the text. The text is the best source that I believe we have as far as getting back to what the Creator asks of us. And so that is what I am attempting to pay attention to and to prioritize. As I talked about in my recent video on this subject, I think that the Torah calendar issues are often somewhat vague and are largely being pieced together from circumstantial evidence in the text. And indeed, calendar is not even a word that is in the text. We are talking about a group of issues like the day, the month, the year, etc. And while there are some specific commands on it, most of the cases which are made to advocate a given view on this subject seem to involve a lot of assumption, a lot of confirmation bias, seeing only validation, and a decision might even be made on this subject based on heuristics, based on some sort of shortcut like going with a tradition or going against a tradition or going with a belief about what is natural. And I also recognize that almost any debate on this subject results in both sides at the end claiming that the other side is not paying attention to the evidence, that the other side is ignoring the facts, ignoring the evidence. The fact is, with the calendar issues or anything else scriptural, people will give different degrees of importance to different verses. And as we will see with this, people will focus on the exact same verses for proof texts, whether it be Genesis 1:5 or Leviticus 23:32, and people will use them in completely opposite ways to be evidence of their completely opposing views. And as mentioned earlier, it's very easy for one person to place a different amount of weight on a verse compared with another person. It is easy whenever there is any especially long case for any issue, any especially long presentation, that a person may see one thing which is disagreed with and assume that that invalidates everything else. And I also recognize that it's possible some of the verses that I will be looking at were not really intended to be taken so literally or to be scrutinized to the degree that I have done. And so it's very likely that there will be some verse here that maybe I'm not taking the entirely intended view upon. But what I am presuming is that by focusing on what the text says, that we're going to get closer to the truth than just making stuff up or than just taking a belief and projecting it onto the text. And so even though I have sought to think this through very carefully, keep in mind that this is just what I am seeing. Now, that probably goes for everything I say on the channel, but I thought it would be particularly relevant with this issue. What I want to do in this video is talk about my study of the day, of the Yom, and the issues that relate to it, such as when does it begin, when does it end, and are there multiple meanings to the word Yom, and what does this mean practically? And I think it may be important to begin by laying out the case or the points in favor of the evening beginning for the day, of beginning the day at Erev. And from there, I want to move into looking at the day, the Yom, in general, and considering some of the different possible views for it. and then I intend to move into a major point of the study, which will span a good part of the video, and that is the study of the Hebrew word erev, which is usually translated as evening. The reason I want to focus on that is because there is a common view that the day begins at or around that time, and so if that is the case, that should be evident as we study erev. And if it is not the case, then that should also be evident. And that would leave us with weighing the other options for when the day begins. Let's consider the case for the evening. What are the verses or the points that favor evening or otherwise would be used in support of beginning the day at evening? I think there are three predominant points that would be cited from the text, and that is going to be Leviticus 23:32, which is the Day of Atonement, Yom HaKippurim, command regarding the timing of that observance, as well as Genesis 1:5, the reference to the evening and the morning, and then the timing of the festival of unleavened bread, or the eating of unleavened bread and the not eating of leavened bread, the timing of that. Also, there could be the issue of uncleanness and becoming clean from uncleanness, how that is timed according to the evening, and the new moon and the traditional views. Let's consider Leviticus 23:32. So this is the Yom HaKippurim timing command. One rendering of it might be, "It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and ye shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at even, from even unto even, shall ye celebrate your Sabbath." Of course, that's the King James Version. Another rendering might be, "A cessation, a special cessation, it is to you, and you shall humble your beings in the 9th of the month in the evening. From evening unto evening you shall keep your cessation." Or another reading of that might be, "From evening unto evening you shall cease your cessation." So you shall cease work for your cessation, for your Shabbat. This is a command regarding the timing of Yom HaKippurim, and whenever we look across the text at the different commands regarding Yom HaKippurim, we see over and over that it is said to be in the 10th, that in verse 27, in the 10th of this 7th month, it is the day of the coverings, and it refers to this very day in various passages. It refers to the 10th of the month in Leviticus 16:29, whenever it's giving the commands regarding the ritual and giving the commands regarding what the people in general are supposed to do. As a result, this verse, Leviticus 23:32, may be seen as explaining how the day works, because all of these other verses say that it's the 10th day, and then we have in Leviticus 23:32 that it describes the observance begins in the 9th of the month in evening, from evening unto evening. It begins in the 9th of the month, the 9th of the month in the evening, from evening unto evening. If the 10th day starts in the 9th day at evening, if that is understood, then one could easily conclude that that is probably the general pattern for the day. Therefore, maybe this is evidence of the day beginning at evening. Also, another verse which is commonly looked to would be Genesis 1:5, and also the other similar verses in the same chapter. In the King James and some other traditional translations, and I'm only citing the King James here because it's probably the most well-known rendering of this verse. It's the one that a lot of people will automatically think of. So in this translation of it, we have, "And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day." Clearly, this seems to be laid out in this translation that this is like an equivalence, once again, that the evening and the morning were the first day. Therefore, the evening and the morning must be equal to the first day. That must be how it is composed. Another way of translating this might be, "And Elohim called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And it was evening, and it was morning, day one." And the other verse which may be cited in support of the evening view might be Exodus 12:18, where it says, "In the 1st, in the 14th day to the month, in the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day to the month in the evening." We have that the unleavened bread is beginning to be eaten on the 14th day at evening, and elsewhere it says the 15th day is when the festival of unleavened begins. So maybe this is another example of an equivalence. The 14th day at evening equals the 15th day elsewhere. And if you compare that to whenever it says in Exodus 12:15 that 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, you can fairly easily fit a count of 7 times 24 hours into that evening to evening observance that's described. So those would be the primary textual points I think that would be raised with the evening case. Those are probably the ones I would have focused on, especially those first two. There may be some other verses that might be cited from elsewhere in the Nach, in the non-Torah parts of the Tanakh, but I'm not going to consider those because this is the Torah-centric channel. My view is focused on what does the Torah command rather than what does some other later text command. And also there is the issue of uncleanness. That is another textual point, but it doesn't really lay it out in the same way. It just might make logical sense to say that, okay, whenever the new day begins, surely that's whenever you become clean if you're unclean. We know, based on the fact that it is said over and over and over in the text, that a person becomes clean typically at evening, and that would presumably only make sense because the evening is already viewed as a transition point between days. Also, there is the issue of the new moon. So whenever it comes to the first crescent of the new moon, and I do believe that that is the likely meaning of the Hebrew word chodesh, I do believe that first crescent or first visible crescent does make the most sense with the evidence that I have seen, such as with how it is used in the cognate languages like Ugaritic, for example. I do think that first crescent makes the most sense for the Hebrew word, which is translated as month, and so if that is the beginning of the month, is on the day of the new moon, then there may be a practical advantage to having the day begin around sunset, because the new moon is only visible, the first crescent is only visible right after sunset. And if we're already paying attention to the evening, it would make sense to say that if the new day begins right after sunset, just hypothetically, then that's convenient that the new moon would be citable at that same time, because then you could say that at the moment the new moon is sighted is roughly equivalent to the moment the new day is beginning, thus the new month is beginning at the same time as a new day. Of course, this is going to depend on a person's view on the moon. There are other traditional views that hold the evening-to-evening view and yet do not acknowledge a first crescent beginning for the month. And so this is only going to be relevant if a person believes in starting the new day and the new month at the same time as the sighting of the moon. And the last point that I'm going to raise in this case for the evening might be the point of tradition favoring evening. In Jewish tradition, often they will cite the evening as the beginning of the day, or in some cases it may be a little looser than that, and maybe even what I would call night as the beginning of the day. But usually it is evening, and with the Samaritans, as far as I understand, they believe it is at sunset. That sunset, or maybe even before sunset, is when they begin the new day. And if a person believes that the Samaritans have been more on track or somewhat on track for the past 3,000 years or so, and that they are still carrying on what was done before because calendar might be a difficult thing to change, if one thinks that could be the case, then clearly there is a traditional support here from many angles. As far as I am aware, even though in some of the Jewish traditional writings they will cite people that held this view of beginning the day at morning, as far as I am aware there are no major Jewish groups that have ever held that view in prominent or public awareness at least. evening or night is favored by far when traditional views are considered. So these are the points that I probably would have cited in the past favoring evening or night, and these are some of the points which I have also heard cited in favor of these views. And I wanted to fully acknowledge that and validate having held that view from the beginning of this before we now move into the discussion of the day, the discussion of the different views on the day. From what I see, there are 4 primary views on the day. Number 1, probably the most popular, is beginning and ending the day at or around Erev, at evening. And there are subcategories to the evening view depending on how exactly Erev is defined, just as with some of these other words. And number 2 is probably the least talked about whenever this subject is debated nowadays, but I think it deserves inclusion in the list, and that is beginning and ending the day at Lila, at night or darkness. This one does seem to have some traditional basis to it, even though it's not usually framed that way. It's probably usually just treated as another view regarding Erev, regarding the timing of evening. The third view we will consider is beginning and ending the day at Boker, at morning. And there are subcategories to that, depending upon how you define the beginning of Boker. Is it at the point of the first light, or is it at the point of sunrise? And the last view that we will consider is the day simply being daytime, beginning at the first part of morning of Boker and ending at the end of Erev, at the end of evening. And it's possible that this view of a daytime Yom, of a Yom being the daytime, may be treated as the only definition of the day, or it could be held alongside any of the other views as simply an additional meaning for the word Yom. So someone could hold one of the first 3 views and also hold this one as just another meaning of the word Yom. So these are the views that I considered in my study of this: evening, night, morning, and daytime only. The first thing I want to show you from the text is how the word Yom is used, and the fact that Yom does sometimes mean just the daytime. Numbers 11:32. And the people rose all of that day, and all of the night, and all of the day of the following day. And they gathered the quail, all of that day, day being Yom, and all of the night, night being Lila, and all of the day of the following day. So this one is a bit more complicated because of how I translated it. The first day in all of the day is Yom, and then following day is one Hebrew word, Mocharath, and Mocharath on its own means following day. So the day, the Yom, is clearly separated from night here. Night is not included in either of these 2 days. So the day, the Yom, is just referring to daytime here, even though it is the same word that shows up for calendar dates. And let's consider Exodus 24:18 and other verses which are worded similarly. And Moses was in the mountain 40 day and 40 night. Day and night are separated in this description. Likewise, we see this in Exodus 10:13. Wind of the east in the land all of that day and all of the night. It became the morning, and wind of the east carried the locust. The day is separated from the night in this verse as well. All of that day and all of the night. This is also the case in Genesis 1:5. And Elohim called to the light day, Yom, and to the darkness he called night. So I provide these examples to show that this is a way the word Yom is used. There is basis for saying that Yom can be just daytime without any inclusion of night. Regardless of one's other views about the day or about what we might think of as a full day, it is clearly the case that the day can span from morning to evening and not include the night, that it can be just the daytime based on these preceding verses. And that's even the case when it says all of that day. But we can also see that it can be used another way. Leviticus 8:35, "And at the opening of the tent of meeting you shall dwell by day and night 7 days." With Aaron and his sons in the initiation of his priesthood, they were told to dwell for 7 days, and it says by day and night. The by day here is one Hebrew word. It is the word yomam, which is related to yom, and the night is Lila again. So in this verse at least, with this command at least, the day is said to include both daytime and night. So we have yom as daytime, as distinct from the night, and we also have yom as including day and night with this Leviticus 8:35 verse. As a side note, there is also a concept of a, quote, complete day, end quote, which shows up in Joshua 10:13. But that wording does not show up in the Torah. And as you know, if you have been around the channel before, or if you have noticed the name of the channel, I don't want to focus on non-Torah concepts or wordings, at least as much as I can avoid it, especially in case there may have been a change in calendar view or practice at some point. And the question I wanted to focus on in this study is, when does the day begin and when does it end? If we are just talking about a yom with the meaning of daytime only, or the period of light only, clearly there is no night involved at all. So it would begin in the morning, in Boker, and end at the conclusion of evening, at the end of Erev. Based upon at least the first few verses we looked at, that would constitute all of the day. But what about a supposed complete day, or what we might call a 24-hour day? How would that work? I want to highlight that there are commands which give different schedules for their observance. Some specify that they begin or end at evening, and on the other hand, there are timed events or timed observances that begin in the day or begin in the morning. For example, Leviticus 23:32 has the evening beginning for Day of Atonement, Yom HaKippurim. It says it begins on the evening of the 9th day, and it is from evening unto evening. And on the other hand, the anointment of Aaron ritual, which we already looked at, Leviticus 8:35, says that this command is by day and night, a different progression of the day. Instead of saying evening unto evening, or instead of saying that it starts at evening, it says 7 days and it says by day and night. And my opinion is that we really need to pay attention to what the text says. If we care about what the text says at all, we need to pay attention to the wordings which appear in the text. And so regardless of anyone's overall position on this subject, we should be able to see here that this one observance is from evening unto evening, and this other observance is by day and night. And clearly both of these can exist, both of them can coexist. There's no reason, as far as I know, that the Creator couldn't tell us to follow one pattern in this one case and follow another pattern in this other case. I am aware of this idea, now this is not my personal view, but I am aware of an idea in certain academic circles that presumes that the Torah was progressively, according to them, progressively edited, and their position is that the people originally used one calendar, and then later on, in a later version of the text, they started using another calendar. And while I think there is clear evidence of a change in calendar because there is the adoption of the Babylonian month names later in the Tanakh, while at least that evidence is there, these academics take it further than I do. They presume that any difference in a pattern in the commands, such as we see here, is evidence of a difference in timekeeping, and therefore a difference in author. And the existence of multiple patterns in their mind is just a result of a mishmash of sources or the vestiges of the earlier way things were done. However, I do not presume that with my study approach. As I mentioned, I am just seeing it as a different pattern of time for different commands, and I'm not afraid of that. I don't have a problem with that. My intention here is to see if there is a consistent and coherent way to understand it, mainly because I don't want to fall into this trap of thinking that I supposedly know what is really going on. And whether it's possible or not, and the fact that the Samaritan Pentateuch exists shows that there were edits at least one way or the other, I don't want to start claiming to know where supposedly all the edits are in the text. I don't want to start thinking I know whenever the only basis would be my own hallucination of what I think was supposedly said originally. And so essentially my mindset in approaching this was with the assumption that it is able to be resolved in a reasonable, coherent way, and I believe that it is. Let's look a little bit more into the progressions of time in the text, and let's consider another set of terms which are used. Within the Torah commands and the Torah narrative, there are two words which are related to each other and are commonly translated as tomorrow or the day after. These are מחרת and מחרת or מחרת. The latter of the two we have already seen one example of, as we will soon be reminded. These two words appear to be largely interchangeable in meaning, and they will sometimes be used alongside each other in the same passage, describing the same time progression, like in Exodus 9, 5 through 6. The only exception I see to this is with מחר, and it is sometimes used in a more vague sense, to talk about a general future time, but whenever they are used in a specific way, both words appear to overlap and share the same meaning. And so, what is that meaning? I mentioned that they are normally translated as tomorrow or the day after, but as with any translation, we need to be careful with reading too much into a translation. If the chosen interpretation for the word is the day after, that doesn't necessarily tell us what the day, the Yom boundary is. As you may recall with מחרת, or as will be seen, it does appear to at least begin at the daylight hours, the time referred to by these words. But we probably should not come to a conclusion based upon that idea alone, a conclusion on Yom. However, this meaning and the usage of these words clearly is relevant because it is a normal frame that is used within the language and within the text. Therefore, it is something we should know about if we want to investigate the course of the day in the text. And let's start out by returning to Numbers 11:32. We already looked at this verse whenever we were thinking about the word Yom in contrast to the night, Lila. This word translated as the following day or as the morrow is מחרת, and in this verse in particular it refers to the day of the מחרת. And we can see that the way things are broken down here, as we previously acknowledged, there is all of that day, day being Yom, all of the night, night being Lila, and all of the day of the following day, Kol Yom Ha-Mocharoth. In this verse, the first day here is divided from the night, and also the night is separate from the following day, from the day of the Mocharoth. Let's look at some other examples, and this example is not ideal because it is from Samuel, but it is a clear use of מחר, the word related to Mocharoth. 1 Samuel 19:11. And Saul sent agents to the house of David to watch him and to put him to death in the morning. And Michal, David's woman, told him to say, if you are not escaping with your life the night, tomorrow you are put to death. And for a point of clarification on this the night, it is common to see the Hebrew literal equivalent to the night translated as tonight, just as the day, hayom, can be translated as today in the proper context. So a less literal translation would say, escape with your life tonight. And this tomorrow here is מחר. It is related to מחרת, the previous word. So what is going on here? David and his wife are hatching this plan to protect him from Saul, and so his wife is going to lay out the teraphim, multiple idols, or the single life-sized idol that they keep in their house or allow in their house for whatever reason. Feel free to let that sink in. And their idol is going to be used as a body double for David, and then David is going to escape. So according to his wife in this verse, he has to escape the night or tonight. Otherwise, tomorrow he will be put to death. And if we connect it with the earlier part of the verse, clearly the word for morning, boker, is used here for the time they intend to kill him. There is an apparent connection in this verse between מחר and the coming morning. And there is clearly a separation between the night and that following day, at least the following day in the sense of the daytime. And this could be similar to the pattern that we saw with the first Moharoth reference that we looked at, where it said day, night, and following day. Mahar is also used in Numbers 16, 5 through 7, and feel free to check out the rest of this passage, but for the sake of space, I am skipping a portion here. And he spoke to Korah and to all of his assembly to say, morning, and Yahuwah shall make known who belongs to him and is the set-apart one. Then in verse 7, regarding the fire pans which they are then taking, and give fire in them and place incense on them before Yahuwah tomorrow. And this is reiterated in verse 17, and it says that they did it in verse 18. So there appears to be this connection between morning, boker, and tomorrow, mahar, similar to what we just saw. And feel free to compare that with the course of events described here. Also, let's look at Exodus 10:4 and 10:13, the plague of locusts. For if you are refusing to send my people, behold me bringing the locust into your border tomorrow. And in verse 13, it became the morning, wind of the east brought the locust. At this point, we are likely seeing this pattern, this association between mahar and the following daytime at least. And this relates to some of the patterns of observance for certain commands, as we will see. There are a few more examples I want us to see at this point. There is a 3-day pattern that shows up in Exodus 19. This is leading up to the giving of the 10 words, the 10 commandments. In verse 10, and Yahuwah said to Moses, go to the people, and you shall sanctify them the day and tomorrow. And they shall wash their garments, and they shall be prepared for the 3rd day. The way that this progression of 3 days is described is the day or today, hayom, tomorrow, mahar, and then the 3rd day. Now, it could be said that maybe this is not overly significant because maybe they are just doing the sanctification and the cleansing in the daytime. And regardless of what it may or may not be getting at or the exact reasons why it may be stated in this way, I think a good general principle in the study of language is that it is useful to pay attention to how things are framed, and in this case, how a 3-day pattern might be framed. And that's really the extent of what we have access to if we are relying on the text. The text shows us how these things can be framed. And the way that the 3 days are framed here, there is the day, hayom, there is tomorrow or the following day, mahar, and there is the 3rd day. And there is a similar pattern which will appear shortly that uses the word mocharat or mocharath. I have another example for mahar, but I will save it for later. And now I want us to look at 2 more examples for mocharath. In Genesis 19:34, there is this interesting story, I guess you could say, about Lot and his daughters. The daughters decide they are going to get him just totally drunk 2 nights in a row, and take advantage of him to preserve his lineage. Therefore, we have a sort of 2-day pattern in this case. And it was from the following day, and the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. We shall make him drink wine also the night. Here we start off with saying that this is the following day. This is מחרת, and this is at least the daytime which follows the events of the previous verse, the previous night. And it also uses the word emesh, which is translated here as last night, but this word does not show up in the commandments whatsoever. Then it says they will make him drink the night or tonight. In this verse, the previous night is separated from מחרת, from the following day. The previous night is separated from the following day. Now for the last example of מחרת. This is in Leviticus 7:15 through 18 regarding 2 types of offerings and when they are supposed to be eaten. Starting in verse 15. In the day of his offering it shall be eaten. He shall not leave from it until morning. So this particular kind of offering is supposed to be eaten on the day it is offered, in the day of his offering. And the way this command is framed, it becomes a problem if the offering is kept until the morning. And I noted that some of the rabbinic opinions will literally try to add in the word night here. They will try to say that the text should have said something about the night somewhere here, or that it supposedly implies it according to the alleged wisdom of the sages. Just note that the text does not use the word for night here. It just says to eat it in the day of his offering, and it is a problem if it is left until morning. Let's consider the immediately following verses, and it shifts into talking about a different offering here. In the day of his offering, his sacrifice, it shall be eaten, and from the day after, and the leftover from it shall be eaten, and the leftover from the flesh of the sacrifice in the 3rd day shall be burned. So this is another 3-day pattern, and like with the first 3-day pattern in Exodus 19, which was the day, hayom, tomorrow, מחר, and then the 3rd day, here we have day of his offering, and from the day after, which is מחרת, and the 3rd day. Day of his offering, מחרת, and the 3rd day. And if we were to contrast that to the rules laid out in verse 15, the first verse of the series, instead of being allowed to eat it on the day of his offering and the following day, the מחרת, you have to eat it in the day of the offering. You do not leave from it until morning. So this could be another connection between מחרת and morning based on the contrast there. And it might be worth noting that in this verse 15, regardless of the exact definition of yom or where the day boundary is, for the purposes of this command, the specified boundary, what it says in the text for the boundary for this command, is the morning. Thus far, we have considered the uses of 3 different words. We have considered the use of the word yom and how it can be used for daytime only, and how it can be used for apparently a broader period of time, like by day and night, 7 days, in Leviticus 8:35. And we have considered the words מחר and מחרת or מחרת, which refer to tomorrow or the following day. And we looked at how these words are used in the text and how there is a frequent connection between מחר, מחרת, and the following morning or the following day time, at least. So this is important context for understanding the progression of time and the framing of time within the text. And these are things we will want to remember and want to recall while and after we've looked at the Hebrew word for evening, the word erev. So let's go into the issue of the evening of erev. So erev, erev, evening, is associated with sunset or sundown, at least in part. We can see this in Deuteronomy 16:6. You shall slaughter the Passover in the evening as the sun sets. And this sun sets, it's literally the sun enters, or the sun is entering, or the sun is coming, like coming and going. And in Deuteronomy 23, verse 12 or verse 11, and it shall be as the evening is coming, or as I would understand it, it shall be at the onset of evening, he shall wash in water, and as the sun sets, he shall come to the midst of the camp. And you can compare the wording in Leviticus 15:16, and he shall wash all of his flesh in water, and he shall be unclean until the evening. So there appears to be this association with the sun setting, the sun entering, and of course we have our definition of what the sun setting means, and I want to raise the possibility that the exact lines may be different from the modern framing, so that's just something to be aware of. And you might compare the wordings in Genesis 24:63, Exodus 14:27, or Judges 19:26. So let's consider the cognate languages. Let's consider the related Semitic languages and the use of similar words to Erev. The pattern that I see is that the comparable word can mean sunset or sundown. In Ugaritic, which some believe is an Amorite language, it is a verb which refers to entering or coming. So the comparable word, there is a verb associated with it which refers to entering or coming, similar to the Hebrew word bo, like we saw with those previous verses about the sun setting. And it also appears to be used for the sun setting or going down. In Akkadian, the comparable words are similarly used for entering or coming, the sun setting or going down, and the west, the westerly direction. So as an example of this, one text referred to in the setting or in the going down, light of mankind is darkened. And in Arabic, the comparable word, at least in more modern use, can refer to the sunset or the sun being below the horizon. And I do not cite all of these as proof of what Erev means in Hebrew. I don't cite it as proof because there can be variation, but I cite it as clues or things that we might consider as we are looking at this subject. Let's also consider the possible etymology of the Hebrew word Erev, so the verb arav. There are rabbinic opinions that assert that mixing is the etymology, so there must be this implication of mixing with the word translated as evening. And this is what I would have asserted in the past. This is what I thought was going on whenever I was looking at the text before. But in my view now, this appears to be unlikely. As referred to earlier, despite the fact that evening or sunset, sundown appears as a meaning for the cognate words in Akkadian and Ugaritic, the meaning of mixing is unattested for those verbs in Akkadian and Ugaritic, as far as I can see. If mixing were the basic meaning of Arav or the etymology of Erev in the context of the day, it is conspicuous that no such meaning accompanies it in those languages. There's no meaning of mixing. And this suggests to me that mixing must be from a separate root, which is unrelated to the word for evening. Instead, I would see setting or going down or darkening as a possible meaning for the Hebrew verb arav, as we would see in Isaiah 24:11 or Judges 19:9. And once again, I'm just citing those for the purposes of the language. And just to clarify, I'm not referring to every single time the verb spelled this way is used in the text. It is clear that there are other meanings, such as mixing, that appear with a word which is spelled this way, but I am referring to, in these sorts of contexts, what this root appears to mean, which is connected with Erev, evening. And when it comes to what defines the evening, or what is the overall span of evening, there are two primary positions that I see on this. And I'm going to cite some of the rabbinic views just because that is the prominent source of discussion on this. And in my view, it covers the likely possibilities because the rabbinic views are not all in agreement on this. So in some of the more rabbi-centric circles, option 1 tends to be favored. Option 1 is that it starts at noon and that it ends either at the sun disappearing below the horizon, or it starts at noon and ends at darkness. And the justification for this, from my understanding, is that just after the highest point of the sun's arc in a given day, just after that, it begins to go down. And so the one view is that, well, this must begin the evening. And that's one of the views that is used in the rabbinic literature. And option 2 would be that evening is sunset, or it is the period from sunset to darkness, also known as dusk or twilight. I have noticed that this tends to be favored by some of the more recent translations, and it appears to be favored by some of the more textually focused rabbinic literature as well. And there is a bit of circumstantial evidence that I will cite regarding option 2, regarding the dusk view. In Exodus 27, 20 through 21, which we will refer to again, it appears that the lamps of the tabernacle, the lamps of the tent of meeting, are supposed to burn from evening until morning. And while this is admittedly a bit speculative, when would a person normally light a lamp? Probably not at noon. Probably more likely you would light the lamp as darkness is approaching, such as around sunset. And for some other clues on when Erev might be, we might refer to Genesis 19, 1 through 5, that appears to indicate that it's around night or prior to night. Genesis 24:11 indicates that it is the time of drawing water, and I'm going to assume that it's probably not darkness whenever they're going and doing that. In Genesis 24:63 or 65, it refers to being able to see a person, presumably at a distance, and this is before, or as I would understand it, at the onset, at the turning toward the change to evening, Erev. In Genesis 29:23, there's an instance of someone not being able to be identified at Erev, but that could be for some other reason, such as Leah maybe wearing a veil. That is not elaborated upon. In Numbers 9:15, also verse 16, there's the description of the cloud which is over the tent of meeting, and it refers to that it had the appearance of fire, and it says in evening, in Erev, and that it lasted until the morning, until Boker. And in verse 16, it refers to the appearance of fire at night. And if we want to refer to the Nach, there's Jeremiah 6:4. The day turns, or the day dwindles, for shadows of evening are being stretched out. So there is some sort of change either with the day or with the daytime that is connected with Erev, and there is this connection with evening shadows. And in Zechariah 14:7, this is from a prophecy which is about a recreated world, and it refers to not day and not night. So there's not going to be day or night in normal terms, and it shall be at evening time, it shall be light. And so I'm assuming that there is some level of darkness associated with evening, associated with Erev, but as previously referred to, it seems like it is not total darkness, and as we know based upon Deuteronomy 16 and some other verses, sunset is associated with Erev and takes place apparently within Erev. So in my view, based upon what we have considered thus far, the most likely time period is sometime around what we would call sunset, most likely around the time of sunset or dusk. And as far as the text of the commands and the narrative surrounding the commands is concerned, the time frame which follows evening or follows Erev appears to be night, appears to be Lila. And so night in Genesis 1, if we go by that, is defined as darkness. So while this is a bit of a judgment call, I would see it as likely that Erev is the time around sunset until darkness. Therefore, it would be dusk or twilight in modern English terms, or maybe slightly before sunset until darkness. That is how I am seeing it. So let's start looking more in depth on what the Torah text says about evening. And one thing that you will note is that there is another phrase related to evening, related to Erev, which shows up that we need to take into account. And that is the phrase literally might be translated as between the evenings, bein ha'arbayim. And this appears in the commands. And so knowing what this means is going to be relevant in how we assess some of these issues. So with most English translations, from what I have seen, most of them do not clarify any distinction between these two. Most of them, even though you might literally have a translation of between the evenings, most English translations just leave that as evening. You would have no idea that there's any difference from any other instance of just plain evening based upon that. And while I will get into in a little bit some of the ideas on this, I'll point out that some people have the idea that, okay, this must be two different evenings, that there must be plural evenings, because this is plural, evenings. So there must be at least two evenings, and there must be a point in between these two evenings. That's one view on it. However, it's possible it should be translated differently from that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. One thing that I would note up front is that evening and between the evenings, they appear to coincide in time. So in Exodus 16:12 through 13, we have, between the evenings you shall eat flesh, in the evening the quail came up. So Elohim in the beginning of this passage says that between the evenings you shall eat flesh, and then in the narrative, whenever it's describing what took place, in the evening the quail came up. And so we might consider two possibilities here. One is that in the evening is not necessarily the same thing as between the evenings, or that they do coincide, that they do overlap. So if we're thinking about this passage, the quail would have to come up, the quail would have to appear before the people could eat them. And so the quail came up in the evening, and it says that between the evenings you shall eat flesh. So if evening and between the evenings, if those are not overlapping, if they do not coincide exactly in time, then in this case, evening would appear to take place before between the evenings. So the quail appeared in the evening, the eating of the quail would need to take place after that, eating between the evenings. But let's contrast that with some other passages. So in Exodus 27:20 through 21, the light, Aaron and his sons shall arrange it from evening until morning. And you can see also Leviticus 24:3 on this. And let's look at Exodus 38. When Aaron is lighting the lamps between the evenings. So let's think this through once again with this context, with this set of verses. So presumably this first part where Aaron and his sons are arranging it from evening until morning, I don't think that literally means that they are there like arranging it for all night. Like I don't think that's what it means, that instead presumably they are setting it up so that it will burn from evening until morning. And then it says that Aaron is lighting the lamps between the evenings in Exodus 30 verse 8. So if Aaron lights the lamps between the evenings, and it is supposed to be arranged, presumably arranged to burn, from evening until morning, then between the evenings would either need to come before evening, or it would need to coincide with it. So if we're treating it as a separate period of time, if we're treating between the evenings as a separate time from just plain evening, then this might conflict with the quail verse, which has it the opposite arrangement. So in order for both of these passages to coexist, to work together and not be contradictory in their terms, either option one, between the evenings is literal, that is supposedly the correct translation, and evenings, plural, would be a true dual or a true plural that represents two or more separate evenings. And the phrase would therefore indicate that there's this time between two periods of sunsetting or two periods of evening. Therefore, with this option, evening indicates one of the two single events or periods of time, and between the evenings may be a span between those. Setting point one might be true noon, going by the one rabbinic view, and then sunset would be number two, or true noon and then the disappearance of the sun's light, or sunset and the disappearance of the sun's light, or something else. Like those would be the possible evening one and evening two with this view. So if we were to take this idea of two separate evenings, evening in the text and in the commands would sometimes mean a first evening. And then other times in the commands, evening, just plain evening, would sometimes mean a second evening. So in some commands, that would mean that the first evening must be referred to, and then some it would be the second evening must be referred to. And we would not know because no such distinction is ever clearly made in the text. It never says on the first evening this or on the second evening this. It never says the evening of the day versus the evening of the night, like in some rabbinic distinctions. That is not present in the Torah text, and so that would create a problem in my view. Also, while I cited these examples that seem to show like a sequence of events that seem to show where the time would have to fall, at least to some degree, most of the time there are no context clues in the commands that would allow anyone to differentiate. And so some of these important observances, even ones that involve capital punishment, they might be timed at one of two hypothetical evenings, and there wouldn't be any further explanation, so we wouldn't even know what time to observe it necessarily, at least precisely. And so that's a major issue with this option one. Now, that alone is not necessarily proof because, as we've discussed, Yom can have multiple meanings also, and sometimes that is not clearly delineated either. That being said, in the case with Erev, in the case with evening, I am not seeing in the text a distinction between two separate types of Erev. And the other option, in my view, option two, is that between the evenings, that may not be the correct translation of the phrase, that may not be the correct understanding of it. And evenings in the phrase may not be a true dual. So similar to many other terms that we would treat as singular in English, which appear in plural in Hebrew, such as the word for life, or the word for water, or the word for sky. These are plural in Hebrew, even though we would just use the singular in English. Even though, for example, water may not be distinguished between sets of waters in the context. And with this plural evenings, that may just simply refer to a period of time. And that period of time may be equivalent to the singular evening as well. So between this bein, it may refer to within or among, such as Esther 3:8, or a span of time or interval, such as in Nehemiah 5:18. So one way of reading it, instead of between the evenings, may be something like at evening time. And another point that appears to favor this, in my view, is the fact that evening and between the evenings are used interchangeably between Exodus and Deuteronomy. So we can see in Exodus 12:6, regarding the Passover, all the assembly of the community of Israel shall slay it between the evenings. So Exodus 12:6 says between the evenings. And then in Deuteronomy 16:6, it says, you shall slaughter the Passover in the evening as the sun sets. And also, if you look at the Masoretic text, if you rely on that one, in Deuteronomy 16:4, it says, the flesh which you shall slaughter in the evening. So that verse says in the evening, whereas Exodus 12:6 says between the evenings. And while this one is a little less clear, you may also want to consider Leviticus 6, verse 13, also known as verse 20, and compare that with Exodus 29, 40 through 41. So it's possible that these are not the same ritual. It's possible someone could see them as the same ritual, and there is a similar interchange here if they are the same or if they are related, where it says evening in Leviticus, whereas it says between the evenings in Exodus. So at the very least, we have this interchangeability demonstrated between the Passover commands. So based upon this clear overlap in use, especially with the Deuteronomy passage, what I am seeing here with regard to between the evenings, Bein Ha'arbayim, is that there is some sort of overlap in meaning, whether it is basically equivalent or whether there is slightly more nuance. It appears that there is overlap. And connecting that with what we looked at earlier regarding the information on Erev, regarding the context clues and the suggestions based on those passages and the usage of the word as to what time this falls, what I am concluding is it is likely the time we would call twilight or dusk, that it is around or just shortly before what we would call sunset, and that it is concluding at the onset of night, at the onset of darkness. That is my assessment regarding the actual time frame of Erev. And now that we've looked into that, the question is, how does this work with regard to the order of the day, the timing of the day? When does the day end? When does the day begin? And as usual, I want to encourage us to look at what the text says. Instead of focusing on what the text should or might mean, I want to encourage that we pay attention to the text as much as possible. And so what I see in the text is that between the evenings is a part of the preceding day. It's a part of the day, the continuation of that day, the continuation of that daylight period. This shows up in Exodus 29, 38 through 39, and it also shows up in Numbers 28, 3 through 8 with a similar context. 2 lambs, sons of a year, 2 for the day continually. The 1 lamb in the morning, and the 2nd lamb you shall do between the evenings. The regular offerings for each day done at the tent of meeting include an offering between the evenings. And one point that I considered with this is that the text easily could have just said that the first offering for the day is between the evenings and that the second offering for the day is in the morning. But it doesn't say that. It says that the lamb between the evenings is explicitly the second lamb of the day for the daily offerings. So it says second and it says the day. And on the one hand, we could say that we're naturally going to be thinking of it that way, that we're naturally going to think of the evening as being the second part of the day rather than the morning. And so one view on this may be that this is just kind of a way of describing things that it doesn't have much meaning. But in my view, the reality of the situation is that this is what we have to work with, these types of things. If we take this passage seriously and pay attention to what it says, then between the evenings is a part of the day, a part of the same day as that preceding morning. Likewise, in the first month, in the 14th day of the month between the evenings is the Passover, and in the 15th day of this month is the celebration of unleavened bread. That's Leviticus 23, 5 through 6. So it says the 14th of the month between the evenings is when the Passover takes place. It does not say the 15th of the month. This between the evenings period is explicitly a part of the 14th day, the preceding day. And likewise, Numbers 9:5 says they did the Passover in the first and the 14th day of the month between the evenings. And Numbers 28:16 says, and in the first month, in the 14th day to the month, is Passover. Numbers 28:16 says nothing about evening. It says nothing about between the evenings. It just straight up says the 14th day. The 14th day is when the Passover takes place. Within the view of an evening start for the day, I think there is this assumption that the 14th day at evening or between the evenings is essentially equal to the 15th day. The 14th day at evening is assumed to be equal to the 15th day. Based upon the command, if we were to assume those to be equal, then isn't it strange that the Passover command says it is on the 14th day, and not just the 14th day between the evenings, but the 14th day plainly here? Isn't that conspicuous that it just says 14th day? Between the evenings is not some nebulous time which is unattached to any day. Based upon what it says in the text, it is not a time that is ambiguous on its date. With this observance, it is clearly a part of the preceding day, just like with the daily offering, with the between the evenings offering being the second offering to the day, the same day as that morning. And that is the 14th day in this case. And in reality, this Numbers verse is not any more explicit than any of the other verses about the Passover timing. None of the Passover commands say the Passover is on the 15th day. All of them, which specify a date, say it is on the 14th or on the 14th day. Based upon these passages, between the evenings is a part of the preceding day. It is a continuation of the same day because it uses the same number for the date as the preceding day with the Passover, and it is referred to as the same day with regard to the daily offerings. Now I want to delve into how the text shows that evening is also a part of the preceding day. We already covered earlier how the word erev, the word for evening, appears to be used interchangeably with between the evenings, bein ha'arbayim, at least once, with between the evenings being used for the Passover in most cases, but with just evening, just erev, used in Deuteronomy, or with evening as the sun is setting, used in Deuteronomy. So we already know about one example of this. We may also see this demonstrated in Leviticus 6:13, also known as 6:20, depending on the numbering system. This is the offering of Aaron and his sons, and it says that they are bringing it near in the day he is being anointed. So someone might view this as being only on one specific day, on the day he is anointed, so that one day. So part of the offering is done in the morning, part of it is done in the evening of that day. And the other view is that this is just a continual thing which is done either with that particular priesthood or just period once the Aaronic priesthood is established, that it is done from that point forward every day. But in either case, whether this is describing a single day or a single day that is being repeated effectively, it has the same sequence of the day, morning, and then evening. And let's consider the Yom HaKippurim commands, the Day of Atonement or the Day of the Coverings commands. This is a passage I would have used before as my primary proof text for my previous view on the day, but let's consider what we can see now that we might be looking at things with a different frame of mind. Also in the 10th of this 7th month, it is the Day of the Coverings. It shall be to you a holy convocation, and you shall humble your beings. It is a special observance of ceasing for you, and you shall humble your beings in the 9th of the month in the evening. From evening unto evening you shall keep your ceasing. So ceasing here is Shabbat or Shabbat, and this special observance of ceasing, which appears earlier, is Shabbat Shabbaton or Shabbath Shabbathon. And this is from Leviticus 23, verses 27 and 32. So let's think about this for a bit, because this is a passage which I would have used to say that the day begins at evening. That's how I would have used it in the past. In fact, I'm sure I did use it that way in at least one video before, back in the early days of the channel. So clearly this observance is in the 10th. So Yom HaKippurim, according to Leviticus 23:27 and some other verses, it is in the 10th, and it is described as a day, as a Yom. And the passage repeatedly refers to this very day when describing the rules for its observance. But it also refers to the evening of the 9th. It refers to the 9th in verse 32 of Leviticus 23 being the starting point of this observance. And the fact that it says the 9th here, some will cite, and I had cited at one point, that this is proof that the day begins the evening before. But let's just think about that for a little bit. Part of the 9th day is part of the 10th day. In my view, we have to pay attention to how these things are worded. And so if part of the 9th day is part of the 10th day, I mean, what is going on here? And note here that it says ba'erev. It says in the evening. It says that we are beginning to humble our beings, afflict our beings in the 9th to the month in the evening. So since we know that the observance is commanded to be done in the evening of the 9th, this is going to affect how we are understanding this from evening unto evening. So with regard to this from evening unto evening, let's also consider this phrase regarding that span of time. So this from X unto Y, from evening unto evening. This word od, this word which is translated as unto or until, sometimes it includes both of the times mentioned. That is, from evening unto evening may not mean 24 hours or roughly 24 hours. It may fully encompass both evenings, as we see in at least some of the examples, so that would make it roughly 25 to 26 hours. For example, Exodus 12:15, for anyone eating what is leavened, and that being shall be cut off from Israel from the first day unto the 7th day. So regarding the festival of unleavened bread, anyone eating what is leavened is being cut off from the first day unto the 7th day. And so it doesn't say from the 0th day unto the 7th day. It appears to encompass this first day. And as we know, that is specified in the Yom HaKippurim command in Leviticus 23:32 regarding the 9th in the evening. One other point regarding this timing issue, we might consider Shavuot. So it says in Leviticus 23:15 through 16 that you shall count for you on the day after the ceasing, or the day after the Shabbat, from the day you bring the heap of the wave offering. 7 Shabbats shall be complete, until on the day after the 7th Shabbat you shall count 50 days. So the count is from the day you bring the heap of the wave offering, and that takes place on the day after the Shabbat, according to Leviticus 23:11, and then the count goes until on the day after the 7th ceasing, or the 7th Shabbat. That is a count of 50 days, according to the text. So in order to get that count of 50, you would need to include both the beginning time when it says from the day, and you would count the end time when it says until on the day. So this pattern of from this until that, this wording pattern, has examples in the festival commands and the other festival commands that demonstrate that you are including both part of the or all of the first part and part of or all of the end part. So this pattern, I would not say, is a hard rule. One might be able to find some counterexamples to this, but this is the pattern that does appear in the text. It does appear with festival observance. And so with regard to this 9th evening, from evening unto evening, I am assuming that both evenings are included. And I would therefore infer that we are supposed to observe both periods of evening, both periods of dusk, and the time between those two periods of dusk. And that would be about 25 to 26 hours total, depending upon where in the world you are. And that would be, according to the textual wording, both the evening of the 9th day and the evening of the 10th day. And keep in mind that it's not just from evening unto evening, it also says that it is being observed in the 9th, that it is beginning in the 9th in the evening. So it's not just from the 9th, and actually it doesn't say from the 9th, it says in the 9th. And so while I would have seen this before as stating that the 9th day at evening begins the 10th day, because some of these verses just say the 10th day alone with regard to Yom HaKippurim, now I am paying attention to the fact that it says the 9th day, and to say that the 9th day is a part of the 10th day would be a contradiction of terms in my view. It would be paying more attention to what it supposedly means than what it says, because if we're going to ignore that, then I think we need to have a textual reason to ignore it. Sometimes there's a part of this verse which is assumed to apply to other observances as well, such as maybe the Shabbat in general. The question is, would we apply any of the rest of this to every Shabbat observance? Would we assume that the afflicting of one's being or the afflicting of one's throat applies to the 7th day Shabbat? And we can notice that it is talking about when we are beginning the affliction for Yom HaKippurim here, beginning it on the evening of the 9th. That is what is leading into telling us we are observing it from evening unto evening. This is clearly embedded in the overall command for this particular observance. And separately from this, we will also consider a 7th day Shabbat passage soon. And now I want to talk about this span of time associated with the Festival of Unleavened Bread. So we know it says in Exodus 12:19, 7 days sourdough shall not be found in your houses for anyone eating that which is leavened, and that being shall be cut off. And we looked at the part about from the first day into the 7th day also. So the first day and the 7th day were part of this observance. It took place for 7 days. It says from the first day to the 7th day. It encompassed the first day entirely, and it did not end on the onset of the 7th day. Thus the 7th day is included even though it is unto the 7th, and the first day is included even though it is from the first day. And the reason I'm returning to this is because there is a count that appears regarding the eating of the unleavened bread. In Exodus 12:18 it says that the people are commanded to eat the unleavened bread in the first and the 14th day to the month in the evening unto the 21st day to the month in evening. And so this might be raised as a possible counterpoint, because if the day is considered as starting on the day before at evening, you would be able to get 7 roughly 24-hour periods out of this count in Exodus 12:18. Whereas if you were going off of how the day is delineated in the text, if you were saying that the 15th day is on the 15th day, not on the 14th at evening, then the count would not work in the same way. So there are a few things I want to point out about this. And one of those points is that part of the Passover command is to eat unleavened bread with the Passover, even though Passover or the night of the Passover is never referred to as the 15th. So one thing to note when you're looking at the Passover commands is that it will say that they are eating it in that night. It never specifies the night of the 15th, nor does it say the night of the 14th for that matter. It just says that night. So see Exodus 12:8, etc. And we know from previous references that the Passover is considered, or the Passover slaughter is considered to be taking place on the 14th day. It says either the 14th day in evening or between the evenings, or it just straight up says 14th day. And likewise, the Festival of Unleavened is consistently described as the 15th day whenever it refers to the festival itself. But there is this command, like in Exodus 12:18, that the people are eating the unleavened bread starting in the 14th day to the month in the evening. And one thing that I noted in my looking at the Passover command is that, as mentioned, part of the command is to eat unleavened bread with the Passover. And you can see this in Numbers 9:11. They are commanded to eat unleavened bread with the Passover, even though they are not observing the Festival of Unleavened, even though they are not repeating a second month Festival of Unleavened. So in Numbers 9:11, they're observing the second month observance of the Passover for those who were unclean. They're eating the unleavened bread, even though they are not repeating the Festival of Unleavened starting on the 15th day. So it appears to me that this unleavened bread, which you can see connected, or the prohibition on leavened bread with the Passover, that appears to be connected with the Passover even apart from the festival of that name, even apart from the festival of the unleavened. So the people are beginning to eat unleavened bread in the 14th day to the month in the evening, per Exodus 12:18, and this encompasses both the Passover observance and the beginning of unleavened on the 15th day, which is what Leviticus 23:6 says, among other verses. And it appears to me that a similar 7-day pattern that has the end actually within the 7th day, that shows up with the red heifer command also, with regard to the cleansing of one who has touched a dead human being. In Numbers 19:11, it says, "The one touching in one dead for any human being, and he shall be unclean 7 days." So he's going to be unclean 7 days. And then in verse 12 it says, "He shall purify himself with it in the 3rd day, and in the 7th day he shall be clean. And if he shall not purify himself in the 3rd day, and in the 7th day he shall not be clean." Even though it says he's unclean 7 days, he apparently becomes clean within the 7th day. And so it is not unprecedented to have a 7-day span which does not encompass actually 7 times 24 hours. And in fact, probably the first day was not the entire first day either, because he probably didn't touch the body at exactly the moment when the day began either. And in my view, that shows there are multiple ways to understand this 7 days and this count from evening unto evening, which would not create a contradiction with the rest of what the text says, like would happen with the 14th equals the 15th view. And one evening verse we should consider is Genesis 1:5, which is traditionally translated in the King James Version as, "And the evening and the morning were the first day." And what I will say about this is I see 2 issues with that understanding. That does not appear to be what the text says. The first is that this King James Version understanding would not make sense based upon the apparent meaning of these words. At the very least, it would be leaving out the night, Lila, from the day, because the other 2 do not encompass Lila. Elev and Boker appear to be distinct from Lila, from what I see, from night. So it appears to leave out the night, and it's probable that the bulk of the daytime is also being excluded in this supposed equivalence. And while there are some claims that these words, Elev and Boker, might carry a broader meaning, that is certainly not the norm for evening and morning. And in my view, it doesn't appear that there is any substance to back that up. It just looks like motivated reasoning. So just based upon that issue alone, based upon the definitions of those words, it would not appear to truly be an equivalence here in this verse. And the second issue is that the verse does not appear to be saying that evening and morning combined are equivalent to day 1. It looks to me that this is just the standard narrative pattern. This is just talking about a progression of events in the story, just like the other narrative passages in the text where it says, "And it was in such and such a day," and goes on to explain what went on. It appears to me that Elohim did his work, and that appears to have taken place during the day, And then after that, it was evening. And then after the evening, it eventually became morning. And that was day 1. And it was evening. And it was morning, day 1. Based upon those two elements, the traditional KJV understanding of it does not appear legitimate. And in addition to that, we have to consider the framing of the Torah commands as the most important thing in our understanding of observance. And I'll mention 2 other potential points of holding out on this, and that would be that evening is frequently mentioned in the commands, such as with the purification laws, but those laws do not state when the new day begins. They don't say that the new day coincides with becoming clean. That is not stated, and indeed we see other passages that indicate otherwise. And also the other point might be that if one wants to begin the new month at the sighting of the first crescent moon, then one might logically want to end the day right before the new moon would be sighted. And so this would be right after sunset would be when the new moon is going to be sighted. And while I don't disagree, I actually do agree with Chodesh referring to first crescent. I think that's where the evidence lies on that. That is not my intended point of focus with this discussion. And so I will just say that we can consider there are ways to begin a month according to the new moon without having to cite it in that way or without timing it in that way. I'll talk about that probably in a later video. So what I am seeing is that in the text of the commands, evening and between the evenings are considered part of the day. They're considered part of the preceding day or just a continuation of that same day, depending on how you want to frame it, because the daily offering states this outright. And if that is the case, then when does the full day or the calendar day begin and end? And I will point out that there are many examples in the text where Yom is just the daylight period. There are many examples where it is contrasted with night, where it says day and night, where the two are separated. But there are also examples when a day, when a Yom refers to what we might think of as a 24-hour day. And the most clear example of that, in my view, in the commands themselves would be Leviticus 8:35. That this is at least one example of a day including day and night. And I will point out here that says by day and night in that order. So it says Yomam Walayla, by day and night, 7 days. If we are thinking about the boundary of the full day, the calendar day, when does it begin, when does it end, what are the 2 likely candidates based on what we've looked at? It appears to me that evening, that Erev, is disqualified from consideration because there are verses which show that both Erev and Bein HaArbayim, evening and between the evenings, are counted as the same day as that prior morning, and they hold the same date as the date of that morning. So from the possible views on the day boundary that we have considered, that would leave us with the 2 boundaries which follow evening. Either the new day would begin at night, Lila, after Erev, after evening is concluded, or the new day would begin at morning, and morning, Boker, by my understanding, would begin at daybreak, at first light, at the morning twilight, and I think this definition is most clearly indicated by Judges 19:25 through 26. With the night view versus the morning view, there is a big issue with the night view, and that is that I see nothing in the text that suggests it. There may be some verses where it doesn't say one way or the other regarding night, but I see nothing that would actually support it. Instead, it appears to me that morning is much better supported by the text. And I want to wrap up by talking about a few passages which do so. And we might want to refresh our memory of what we covered earlier regarding the words machar and moharat. We looked at a number of examples which demonstrated these times begin in the daytime. And if they are beginning at the daytime, then they are beginning by extension at the morning. Feel free to go back and revisit that section of the presentation if you so desire, because it is relevant to some of the verses we will be looking at. The first one is the Shavuot command, which we also considered regarding its 50-day count. And there is another part of this verse which is worth recognizing. That is, when does the count begin? And when does the count end? It begins from the מחרת of the Shabbat. It begins on the day following the Shabbat. The count begins in the daytime. So the earliest it could be is the morning of the first day of the week. And when does the count end? The count ends with the מחרת of the Shabbat as well. It goes until the daytime following the Shabbat. So we have a count of days, and the way these days are counted is not from evening, and it is not from night, but it is from the daytime. And that fits with how the 7 days are counted for the anointment of Aaron offering we have been looking at throughout this presentation. By day and night, 7 days. And that also fits with how the Sukkot observance would practically be done. And while I'm not going to dwell on this particular command right now, you might think about, as you're considering this later, how the passage says you are dwelling in Sukkot, in shelters, for 7 days, and also there is an observance at that same location, at the place he chooses to set his name, per Deuteronomy 16. There is an observance on the 8th day. That 7 days of dwelling in Sukkot in shelters, with the 8th day observance that follows it, that fits much more cleanly with the morning-to-morning view, just in practical terms when you think about it. Let's also consider Leviticus 7:15 through 17 as we did prior. Where is the day boundary for the offerings? In the day of his offering it shall be eaten. He shall not leave from it until morning. What does the text say is the line on when this becomes a problem? It becomes a problem in the morning. The boundary given here in this command is at the morning. And in verses 16 through 17, the following verses, this one has a 3-day pattern, like we considered earlier. And how is the day described, and how is the second day described? He is also allowed, in this case, to eat it from the מחרת. The second day is referred to as the מחרת. And the מחרת begins with the following day time. The second day begins with the following day time. Finally, let's consider the first Shabbat command given to the people in Exodus. In Exodus 16:23, how is the timing of it described? It says that the Shabbat is tomorrow. It is מחר. And as we know, מחר begins at the following day time. It doesn't say that the evening is the Shabbat. It doesn't say that that night is going to be the Shabbat. Moses is telling them instead that what Elohim spoke is that מחר is the Shabbat. Now, one might say here that the Shabbat clearly is being connected with the gathering of the manna in this chapter, and that only occurred in the morning, and that may be a reason why this could be framed that way. This is true that it took place in the morning. However, we know that at least one person in the wilderness was punished for doing other sorts of work on the Shabbat as well, not just gathering the manna. And so the Shabbat command in the wilderness went beyond just the manna situation. And despite that, there is no explanation given later that says the seventh day Shabbat actually begins earlier than what was commanded originally here. That verse does not exist in the text. There is no explanation that the seventh day Shabbat begins the night before or the evening before. Beyond what it says about the seventh day, what we have is what it says here, מחר. And if we read Exodus 16:5 as a statement that the people are supposed to prepare all that they are bringing in on the sixth day, let's notice what the rest of this verse says. It says they are supposed to bake and cook and then they are keeping the extra until the morning. Once again, where is the line placed? The line is placed at the morning, which lines up with Mahar. It doesn't tell them to stop before the night. It doesn't tell them to stop before the evening. It just says in Exodus 16:5, they are preparing it on that day, and then they are keeping it until the morning. And then in the morning, in Exodus 16:25, they are eating it today, because today is the Shabbat. From what I am seeing, there isn't any basis to say that the day begins in the evening. In fact, quite the contrary. The text of the commands has passages which contradict that claim. The 14th day in the evening actually equals the 14th day, according to the text. The second daily offering is the evening offering. In order to hold the evening view, one would have to render a large number of verses basically meaningless. One would have to reject what the text says in order to protect what it supposedly means, what it supposedly needs to mean in order to justify the evening view. In order to hold the evening view, the text cannot mean what it says. And it would be one thing if there were textual reasons to think that. But from what I can see, there are not any. There is only tradition. And instead, there are textual reasons to believe what the text says, to believe that the evening really is a part of the preceding day, the same day as the morning. And there are passages which make the day boundary clear. In my view, the day is laid out in the text. Leviticus 8:35 tells us what the day looks like.